I stood by my wife's casket while my own children talked about selling my house before the flowers even dry. They spoke like I was already gone, too. But what if my wife left one clause that turns greed into a legal self-destruction? I arrived at Marrow and Pine Funeral Home at 8:12 a.m. The sky was gray and the air tasted like wet metal. I carried a small box of flowers and my hands smelled of cedar. I had been awake since before sunrise, sitting at my kitchen table with cold tea and no appetite. The building felt too warm. The carpet made no sound under my boots, and a soft piano track played behind a wall. In the hallway, a clipboard sat on a stand with a pen tied to it. Several boxes were already marked, including a line that said the final arrangements were confirmed. That was strange because I had not confirmed anything since the first meeting. I looked at the ink, then at the time on my phone, and kept walking. Inside the chapel, the air smelled like lilies and wax. My wife's casket stood at the front, polished and still. I placed my hand on the wood once. It was cool and smooth. In my head, I said her name and asked her to forgive the noise that might come after. Footsteps sounded behind me. My children had arrived. Briar, my oldest, came in first. Briar's clothes were perfect, the kind of perfect that looks like a statement. Sedge followed, quiet, eyes scanning the room like he was checking exits. Lark moved slower, shoulders curved inward, eyes already red. Briar did not come to stand with me. Briar walked straight to relatives and began speaking in a voice that carried. I heard my name said with a sharp edge. I heard the word control. I heard the phrase that Dad always hid things. Sedge came close to me and spoke softly. He said we needed to handle the estate quickly because things could get messy. He said the house should be listed soon, and it would be better if we did it this week before I got overwhelmed. His tone sounded helpful, but his eyes stayed busy. I told him we would talk later, and that today was for their mother. Sedge nodded, but he watched me like a man watching a door he wants to open. At 9:05 a.m., guests began filling the seats. The chapel had that quiet cough sound people make when they do not know what to do with grief. 2 men from my construction yard came, hats in hand. A neighbor couple sat near the back. I stood near the front row with my hands folded, like I was waiting for a briefing at a job site. Briar moved through the crowd like a host. I heard Briar tell an aunt that I would need help managing money now. Briar said Mom had always handled me. Briar said I was not good with paperwork. People nodded in that polite way that means they want the talk to end. Briar smiled and added that the house was too big for me anyway, and it would be smarter to sell before I ruined something. Sedge drifted toward the side hallway where staff moved. I watched him speak to the funeral director, Garrick Mott. Garrick had a serious face and careful hands. He held a folder tight against his chest. Sedge spoke, and Garrick shook his head once. Then Briar joined them, shoulders lifting like a challenge. Garrick glanced toward me, then back to them, mouth tight. I did not hear the words, but I recognized pressure. The service began at 9:40 a.m. The minister spoke about love and patience. I listened, but I also watched. Briar chose an aisle seat, ready to move. Sedge checked his phone in his lap. Lark stared at the floor and wiped tears with the back of a hand. When the minister asked if anyone wanted to share a memory, Briar stood up fast. Briar spoke about my wife in a clean, shallow way. Briar said Mom worked hard and deserved peace. Then Briar's voice shifted. Briar said Mom carried Dad for years. Briar said Dad made bad choices. Briar said Mom worried about the business and the house. Briar said Mom wanted the kids to protect what she built. I felt eyes on me. Heat rose behind my eyes, but I did not move. I did not correct Briar in the chapel. After the chapel part ended, we moved toward the cemetery at 11:10 a.m. The wind hit my face like cold water. The grave tent flapped once. The ground was soft from rain, and the smell of dirt was strong and plain. While we were still gathered, Briar spoke again, louder than needed. Briar told a cousin that the property would be sold right away because Dad could not be trusted. Briar said Dad would waste it if left alone. Sedge stood beside Briar, calm, as if the plan was already approved. Lark looked at me once, quick and scared, then looked away. Back at the funeral home, people hugged and drifted off. I stepped outside to the parking lot for air and sat in my pickup behind the chapel. I rested my hands on the steering wheel and stared through the windshield at a few leaves sliding across the glass. The passenger door opened. Sedge slid in with a thick folder on his knees. He said it was standard forms. He said signing would make things smooth, and it would show everyone I was cooperating. He tapped the folder lightly, like it was harmless. I did not touch it. I asked what it was. He said it was about the house, the business, and banking access. Just temporary, just until everything settled. I told him I would not sign anything today, and that paperwork would go through my lawyer. Sedge's mouth tightened. He said I was making things harder, and Mom would have wanted peace. I told him Mom would have wanted respect, and peace without respect is surrender. Sedge stared at me for 2 seconds, then stepped out fast. I felt my wife beside me in memory, telling me to watch, not react, and remember. When he left, my fingers brushed something in the center console. I pulled it out and saw a torn piece of cardboard, white with a bright red edge. The words "coming soon" were ripped in half, and the corner had staple holes. My stomach turned cold, not from grief, but from clarity. They were planning this before today. They were executing. I put the torn piece in my jacket pocket, took out a small notepad, and wrote one sentence in calm block letters. They are not mourning. They are moving. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. The church basement smelled like coffee that had been burned twice and covered with sugar to hide it. The floor was cold under my boots, and the folding chairs scraped the concrete in small, sharp sounds. People spoke in low voices, the way they do when grief makes them unsure of their place. Someone had set out paper plates and small sandwiches that nobody really wanted. I stood near the wall with my hands folded, watching the room like I was watching a job site after an accident. I did not want drama. I wanted quiet respect for my wife. But my children were not built for quiet today. Briar moved from group to group like a host at an event. Briar hugged people with one arm and used the other arm to point, to guide, to control. I heard my name said again and again, always with the same tone. Briar told an aunt, in indirect speech, that I could not handle things alone now. Briar said I was too stubborn and too old, and that Mom always managed me. Briar said the house would be too much for me, and the business would be dangerous in my hands. People nodded because they did not know what else to do. A few looked at me with pity. Pity is a quiet insult when you did not earn it. Sedge stayed close to the tables and the purses and the coats. He did not talk to many people. He watched, he checked his phone, he made small trips down the hallway where the restrooms were, and he returned with that same calm face that says nothing. At 12:08 p.m., I saw him near my wife's purse. The purse was set on a side table with a small framed photo of her smiling at our last family dinner. Sedge picked up the purse like it belonged to him now. He opened it quickly, not like a child looking for a tissue, but like a man checking inventory. I saw him take out keys. I saw him slide a small stack of cards into his pocket. I saw him pull out a folded paper and look at it for only a second before hiding it in the folder he carried. He did it all while people ate cake and pretended the world was normal. I walked closer, not fast, not angry. I asked him what he was doing. He said, in indirect speech, that he was securing things so nobody stole anything. He said Mom would want her important items handled carefully. He said he was being responsible. His eyes did not meet mine. He kept his voice even, like he was practicing a role. Briar noticed and walked over, smiling too wide. Briar said I should let Sedge help because I was not thinking clearly today. Briar said grief does strange things to people. I looked at Briar and said I was thinking clearly enough to notice hands in my wife's purse. Briar's smile tightened for a moment, then returned. Briar said I was misunderstanding. Briar said I was always suspicious. Then Briar turned to a cousin and changed the subject like flipping a light switch. Lark was not with them. Lark sat alone near the far corner, shoulders folded in, holding a paper cup with both hands. Lark's eyes were red and swollen, and the cup shook a little. Lark looked like someone who wanted to disappear and also wanted someone to notice. I walked over slowly and sat one chair away. I did not touch Lark. I did not tell Lark to be strong. I only asked if Lark had eaten anything. Lark said no. I placed a small plate with a sandwich on the chair between us, like an offering that did not demand anything. For a few minutes, we listened to the room. Then Lark leaned closer and spoke softly. Lark said, in indirect speech, that Sedge had asked for Mom's phone earlier. Lark said Sedge told Lark he needed it to manage accounts and messages. Lark said it felt wrong because it happened so fast, almost before the service started. Lark said Briar told everyone it was normal and that Dad did not need to see all that stress. When Lark said those words, my throat tightened. I asked where the phone was now. Lark said Sedge had it or Briar had it, and Lark was not sure. Lark wiped tears and said Mom would not like this. Lark said Mom had been careful about privacy. I nodded and told Lark I believed that. I asked Lark one simple thing. I asked Lark to keep one item safe for me, something that did not look valuable. Lark asked what item. I said it was Mom's old hard hat. From the early days, the dusty one she kept in the closet even though she never wore it anymore. I said she wrote something inside the rim and that it mattered to me. Lark looked confused, then said, "Okay." Lark said, in indirect speech, that Breyer and Sedge were already dividing things in their heads like a list. Lark said the hard hat would be easy to hide because nobody cared about it. I told Lark to take it quietly and not tell anyone. Lark nodded once, like a person taking a job assignment. At 12:55 p.m., Breyer stepped onto a small, low stage area near the wall and clinked a spoon against a cup, asking for attention. Breyer said a few words about family. Breyer said we needed unity. Then Breyer said, in indirect speech, that I would probably need to stay with someone soon because the house was too much. Breyer said the kids would handle the business side for my own good. Breyer said it like a kindness. People murmured agreement, not because they knew it was true, but because they wanted the moment to pass. I watched the faces. I saw who looked unsure. I saw who looked entertained. I saw who avoided my eyes. The room was not neutral anymore. It was being shaped. I did not argue in the basement. I waited until the crowd thinned, then I left. I drove to a diner off Route 6 at 2:20 p.m. because I needed a place that felt real. The diner smelled like frying oil and old wood. The booths were cracked. The waitress called me honey without knowing my name. I sat in the back booth where the window showed the parking lot and the gray sky beyond it. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a number I had saved years ago. Elma Keene. My wife had mentioned Alma more than once, always with respect. She said Alma was sharp and fair and did not get impressed by loud people. That was exactly what I needed. Alma answered after 2 rings. I introduced myself and said I was calling because my wife had passed and I needed a consultation. I kept my voice flat. I did not tell Alma the whole story in the first breath. I gave Alma facts. I said my children were pushing me to sign things today. I said they were talking about selling property immediately. I said they were speaking in public about me being unable to manage money. Alma asked, in indirect speech, if any paperwork had been presented. I said yes, in a folder, and I refused to sign. Alma asked if I had copies. I said no, because I did not touch it. Alma paused, then said that was good. Alma said, in indirect speech, that signing under grief is how people lose everything without realizing it. She told me not to sign anything, not even a small form, until she reviewed it. She told me to document every pressure attempt with time and place. She told me to keep my calm voice and not fight in public because public fights become stories other people tell. I asked Alma if my children could claim I was not competent. Alma did not answer in a dramatic way. She simply said that people try many angles when money is involved. She said I should protect myself by doing everything through proper steps. She asked if there was hospice care near the end. I said yes. Alma asked, in indirect speech, if anyone had pressured my wife for access or signatures while she was sick. My stomach went cold. I said I did not know, but I wanted to know. Alma said she understood. She gave me an appointment time for the next morning. She told me to bring a timeline and any basic identity documents, but not to bring family members. She said we would keep it clean. After the call, I sat with my hands around a cup of coffee I did not drink. The heat warmed my fingers, but it did not warm my chest. I looked at the torn, "Coming Soon" cardboard in my jacket pocket and felt the clear line between grief and threat. This was not only about pain, this was about control. I paid the bill at 3:05 p.m. and drove to the hospice center because I needed one more piece of quiet truth before the next wave hit. The hospice hallway was bright and too clean. The air smelled like sanitizer and plastic. A TV in the waiting area played a news channel with the volume low. At 3:48 p.m., I stood outside room 14 and felt my chest tighten, remembering my wife in that bed, small and tired, still trying to smile for me. I did not go into the room. It was empty now. I went to the nurse's station and asked if Nurse Odelia Brandt was on duty. A nurse pointed me down the hall. Odelia met me near a small supply closet. Her eyes were calm. Her posture was tired in a way that honest workers get. I introduced myself. I told her I was my wife's husband, and I said I had one question. I asked who visited my wife during the last week, and who asked about her phone or accounts. Odelia did not answer directly. She said, in indirect speech, that she could not share private details casually. She said rules were strict for a reason. Then she looked at me for a long moment and spoke carefully. She said there were logs. She said shifts were documented. She said visitor sign-ins and staff notes existed. She said if a proper request came through the correct channel, the information would be handled the right way. She said it in the same tone a nurse uses when she wants to help but must stay professional. I asked what the correct channel was. Odelia pointed to a bulletin board where a paper was pinned. The paper listed a number for records requests and a simple process. I took a photo of it with my phone. I did not do it like a spy. I did it like a man trying to follow rules. Odelia nodded once, as if that mattered. Then she said something else, softer. She said, in indirect speech, that people sometimes come when the patient is weak and ask for strange things. She said staff can feel when a visit is love and when a visit is pressure. She did not give me names. She did not need to. The hint was enough to tell me this problem started before the funeral. When I walked back to my truck at 4:35 p.m., the wind had picked up. It moved dry leaves across the pavement in little circles. My phone buzzed with a message from Breyer. Breyer said there would be a family meeting tomorrow and that I should be there. Breyer said it was important and that I needed to stop making things difficult. Breyer said it like an order. A second message came from Sedge a minute later. Sedge said we could handle everything peacefully if I cooperated. Sedge added that Mom would want it. The words felt like a tool being used, not like love. I drove home but did not go inside. I sat in my truck in the driveway at 5:10 p.m. and watched the house windows reflect the gray sky. I thought about my wife's voice. She used to say I was too calm sometimes, but she also said my calm kept storms from destroying us. Tonight, my calm was not comfort. It was armor. I went inside, ate nothing, and sat at the kitchen table with a notepad. I wrote the day in plain lines. Funeral home at 8:12. Basement pressure. Purse search. Folder and truck. Diner call. Hospice bulletin board. I wrote it all as facts, not feelings. Then I set my phone face down and stared at the ceiling for a long minute, letting the quiet settle. At 9:20 p.m., Alma called back briefly. She said she had cleared her morning schedule for me. She said in indirect speech that my children were moving too fast and fast moves leave clean trails. She told me again not to sign anything at the family meeting. She told me to avoid being alone with papers. She told me to bring nothing that could be taken, copied, or used against me. She paused, then said the sentence that made my back straighten and my breathing slow into a steady rhythm. She said, in indirect speech, that tomorrow I should bring nothing except my calm and my clock. At 7:15 a.m., I drove to Alma Keene's office. The streets were still half asleep. The sky looked like wet paper. My hands stayed steady on the wheel, but my chest felt heavy, like I was carrying a load I did not ask for. I parked across the street and sat for a moment, watching people walk their dogs like life was normal. Then I went inside. Alma's office smelled like clean wood and black coffee. The waiting room was quiet, with 2 chairs and a small table that held old magazines nobody touched. A receptionist asked my name and pointed me to a conference room. Alma came in with a thin folder and a calm face. She did not look like a person who needed to be convinced. She looked like a person who needed facts. She asked me, in indirect speech, to start from the beginning and keep it simple. I told her the times and the places. I told her I arrived at the funeral home at 8:12 a.m. I told her Breyer spoke in public about me being unable to manage money. I told her Sedge tried to get me to sign standard forms in my truck right after the burial. I told her I saw Sedge going through my wife's purse at the church basement. I told her Lark said Sedge asked for my wife's phone. I told her I found a torn piece of a real estate sign in my console. I told her about the hospice bulletin board and the records request number. I did not add emotion. I did not say my kids were monsters. I only gave the pattern. Alma wrote without interrupting. When I finished, she asked a few small questions. She asked if anyone had called my workers. She asked if anyone had suggested guardianship or said I was confused. I said yes, not with the exact word guardianship yet, but with the idea. I said Breyer and Sedge kept repeating that I could not handle things and that grief made me unstable. Alma nodded once, like she had expected it. She said in indirect speech that when people want control, they often start by lowering your standing in public. She said it makes later legal moves easier. Alma asked what my wife believed about planning. That question hit me harder than I wanted it to. I took a breath and said my wife was careful. I said she did not like loose ends. I said she used to say she wanted peace after she was gone. I said she once told me not to worry because she planned. Alma watched my face closely, then asked if my wife ever mentioned a trust. I paused. My wife had not used that exact word often, but she had said things like structure and protection. I told Alma I could not promise the word trust, but I could promise the intent. Alma said, in indirect speech, that intent is not enough. She said, paper decides. She said we would find the paper the right way. Alma explained the first steps. She said we would check probate filings. She said we would check public records for any rushed actions. She said we would contact the bank through proper channels. She said we would not confront my children directly. She said confrontation makes them faster and sloppier, but it also makes them hide. She said we wanted them to keep moving in the open because open moves leave tracks. I listened and nodded. I had spent my life building things. I knew you cannot fix a structure by swinging a hammer in anger. You fix it by measuring, checking the base, and tightening what matters. At 9:20 a.m., Alma and I drove to Northgate Bank. We did not ride together. She told me, in indirect speech, that separate arrivals keep things clean. I arrived first and sat in the lobby, watching the clock above the teller line. The air smelled like carpet and printer ink. People spoke in low voices. A small child cried once, then stopped. When Alma arrived, she walked straight to the desk and asked for the trust officer. A woman named Vesper Hale came out a few minutes later. Vesper's face was neutral, but her eyes were sharp. She greeted Alma like they had spoken before, even if only by email. We sat in a small office with a glass wall. Vesper said, in indirect speech, that she could not discuss private details without the correct authority. Alma said she understood. Alma showed identification and explained who I was in simple legal terms. Vesper looked at me and asked for my ID. I handed it over. She checked it carefully, then typed on her computer. The sound of the keys in that small room felt loud. Vesper asked if my wife had any direct instructions about bank access after death. I said I did not know yet. I said my children took her phone quickly, and that worried me. Vesper's mouth tightened slightly. She said, in indirect speech, that phones and passwords create problems when grief is used as cover. She said she could not confirm specific accounts, but she could confirm that my wife had established a relationship with the trust department. She used careful words. She said trust administration and process and formal recognition. She did not say what it meant. She did not need to. Alma's posture changed just a little when she heard those words. It was like watching a foreman recognize the shape of a hidden support beam. Alma asked, in indirect speech, what the next step would be if the court recognized the right authority. Vesper said the bank could move quickly once the court order or proper letters were in place. She said there were internal safeguards, and those safeguards could protect assets from rushed access. She said it with a calm voice, but the meaning was strong. It meant my children's speed could hit a wall they did not expect. Vesper then said she could not do more without proper documents, and Alma agreed. Alma did not push. She only thanked Vesper and said we would return with the correct process. When we stood to leave, Vesper looked at me and said, in indirect speech, that I should not rely on family promises right now. She said people change when they smell inheritance. She said she had seen it many times. I nodded and thanked her. My throat felt tight, but my voice stayed steady. At 11:05 a.m., Alma and I went to the county recorder office. The building was plain and smelled like old paper and cleaning spray. A line of people stood with folders and envelopes. A clerk called numbers in a tired voice. Alma told me to request only public records, nothing dramatic, and to keep the receipt. She said, in indirect speech, that receipts are small, but they show time and intent. I took a number and waited. When my number was called, I stepped up to the counter and asked for recent public activity linked to my property and my wife's name. The clerk asked for basic details, then typed. He printed a sheet and slid it toward me. I did not read it like a treasure map. I read it like a checklist. I looked for dates. I looked for any sudden movement. I saw that no legal transfer had been finalized yet, which was good, but I also saw something that bothered me. There was a record of an information request from the last week. It used a name variation that was close to mine, but not quite mine. The first name was spelled differently. One letter was wrong. That is the kind of mistake a stranger makes, but it is also the kind of move a family member makes when they want to act fast and hope nobody notices. I asked the clerk what that request meant. The clerk said, in indirect speech, that people can request information for many reasons. He said it did not automatically mean fraud. He said it could be a clerical issue. He said he could not guess motives. Alma leaned in slightly and asked if the request included identification or a reason. The clerk said the details were limited, but the request was logged with a time and a reference number. He printed a small receipt with that number. I took the receipt and felt the paper in my fingers, thin and cheap, but heavy with meaning. The exact minute was printed on it. Time matters. We stepped aside near a wall, and Alma looked at the receipt. She did not show emotion. She only said, in indirect speech, that name variant moves often appear when someone tries to create a paper trail without permission. She said it could be sloppy or intentional. She said either way it was useful because it showed urgency and planning. She told me to put the receipt in a safe place and to take a photo of it. I did both. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my wallet behind an old business card. At 12:40 p.m., we left the recorder office and sat in Alma's car for a moment, not driving yet. Alma asked if I had received more messages. I checked my phone. There were several. Breyer said I was acting selfish. Breyer said I was embarrassing the family by involving an attorney. Breyer said we could handle it privately if I stopped being difficult. Sedge's message was softer. Sedge said he wanted peace. Sedge said he did not want fights. Sedge said signing today would protect me. The words looked polite, but the pressure was clear. Alma told me, in indirect speech, not to answer. She said every message was a small trap. She said they wanted me emotional and reactive, because reactive people make mistakes. At 2:10 p.m., we went back to Alma's office. Alma sat with her notes and spoke in short sentences. She said the pattern was consistent. She said my children were trying to seize control before proper authority was set. She said they were testing the edges of the system. She said the bank's trust language suggested there was a structure my wife set up. She said we would not assume anything, but we would prepare for the strongest possibility. She said we would request the probate file and confirm what documents existed through the correct channels. She said we would also prepare a response if my children filed anything about guardianship or incompetence. I asked what I should do about the family meeting they demanded. Alma said, in indirect speech, that I should avoid being cornered. She said if I went, it should be with boundaries and no signing. She said a dinner table is not a legal office. She said people push papers in private because they do not want witnesses. I told her I understood. I admitted my calm was not magic. I admitted I felt tired and alone. Alma did not comfort me with soft words. She comforted me with clear steps. She said the system works when you follow it. Before I left, Alma opened her calendar and circled a date with a black pen. She looked at me and said, in indirect speech, that the real stage was not my kitchen table or a church basement. She said the real stage was the courthouse. Then she tapped the circle once and said the words that made my spine straighten and my breathing slow into a steady line. Probate hearing, courtroom 3B. At 6:30 a.m., I drove to my construction yard office. The morning was cold, and the sky looked like it could rain again. The gravel in the lot crunched under my tires in a steady, honest way. That sound helped me feel normal for a minute. I parked beside the trailer that served as my office and sat still before stepping out. I could smell diesel from a truck that had been started early. I could also smell wet plywood. Those smells were familiar. They belonged to work, not to inheritance fights. Inside the trailer, the air was stale from the weekend. A small heater clicked on and made the metal walls tick. My desk was messy in the way a working desk gets messy, with tape measures, invoices, and pens that never stay capped. I took my jacket off and hung it on the same hook I always used. Then I opened my filing cabinet to pull a basic folder I needed for payroll review. The drawer felt a little too light when it slid out. My hand stopped. The space where one thin folder should have been was empty. It was not a folder that held secrets. It was mostly job notes and old vendor contacts. But it was mine, and it was gone. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the gap like it was a missing tooth. I did not panic. I did not shout. I simply asked myself one question. Who had been here? My foreman, Jory Pell, came in at 7:05 a.m. Jory was a solid man with rough hands and a calm face. He had built walls with me in the early years, before we could afford to hire crews for everything. He looked at me carefully, like he was checking if I was about to collapse. Then he cleared his throat and said, in indirect speech, that Breyer called him yesterday. He said Breyer asked strange questions. He said Breyer asked if I was still sharp enough to run payroll and if I was forgetting numbers lately. Jory said Breyer tried to sound concerned, but it felt like a test. He also said Breyer asked if anyone else could sign checks, just in case. I felt my jaw tighten, but my voice stayed even. I asked Jory what he told Breyer. Jory said he told Breyer I was the same as always and that work was not family business. Jory said Breyer did not like that answer. Jory said Breyer talked about protecting the company from mistakes. When Jory said mistakes, I thought of my children using grief like a tool. I thanked Jory. I told him in indirect speech that if anyone called again with questions about my mental state or my authority, he should say nothing and direct them to my lawyer. Jory nodded. He said he understood. He said he did not want to be a pawn. I walked through the trailer slowly, looking at small signs. The back window latch was still locked. The cabinet doors were closed. The coffee mug I always used was in the same spot, ring stain and all. Nothing looked smashed or rushed. That told me if someone took the folder, they did it quietly, like a person who had been inside before, or a person who did not fear being seen. I did not accuse anyone at the yard. Accusations without proof only make you loud. Loud people get dismissed. At 8:15 a.m., Alma called. Her voice was calm and direct. She asked how I was holding up. I said I was fine and that I had one concern. I told her the foreman call detail and the missing folder. Alma did not sound surprised. She said, in indirect speech, that when people build an incompetent story, they try to involve your workplace because work equals credibility. She said they want concerned witnesses to repeat the same line later. She told me to make a short note of what Jory said, with time and place. I did. Then Alma told me we should secure anything personal that could be taken, copied, or found later. She did not say it like fear. She said it like basic safety. She asked if my wife kept any sealed item or box. I told her there was a legacy box in my hall closet, a sealed box with a brass tag my wife ordered months ago. I had seen the tag, and I remembered the words on it. Open only if they fight. Alma went quiet for a second. Then she said, in indirect speech, that I should not open it. She said I should move it to a neutral, secure place under my name with a clean chain of custody. She said we wanted proof of protection, not a story of tampering. At 9:30 a.m., I drove home. The house felt wrong without my wife's presence. The hallway smelled like her lotion, but it was fading. I stood in front of the closet for a few seconds before opening it. Inside, behind coats and a spare blanket, the box sat on the floor. It was plain cardboard, but it looked heavy with intention. The brass tag was tied with a thin cord. My wife's handwriting was on it, neat and firm. I did not touch the seal. I lifted the box carefully, as if it were fragile glass. I carried it to my truck and placed it behind the seat. Then I drove to a self-storage facility on the edge of town. The place was called Stonegate Storage, and the sign had peeling paint. The office smelled like old air freshener and cheap printer paper. A young clerk sat behind glass and asked what I needed. I said I wanted a small unit, short-term, in my name only. The clerk asked for my ID and ran through a simple form. I signed, paid, and received a gate code. The clerk handed me a small receipt that printed the exact minute. My unit was in row C. The metal doors were dull gray. The aisle smelled like dust and hot metal, even in the cold. I rolled the unit door up, and it scraped in a harsh sound. Inside, the space was empty and clean. I stepped in, placed the legacy box on the concrete floor, and stood over it for a moment. I did not speak to it. I did not pray. I only breathed and reminded myself why it was here. Not to hide from my children, but to keep my wife's intent safe from their hands. Before leaving, I took one photo of the box in the unit. I made sure the unit number was visible. I made sure the timestamp on my phone matched the receipt. I did it like a professional, not like a paranoid man. Then I locked the door and tested it twice. At 11:10 a.m., I got a call from the storage office. The clerk said, in indirect speech, that someone called asking to access my unit. The clerk said the person claimed to be family and said there was an emergency. The clerk said he refused because the account was only in my name and no other person was authorized. He said the caller got angry and hung up. He asked if I wanted to add a note to the file. I said yes. I told him to note that no family member had permission and that any future requests should be refused and logged. The clerk agreed. When I ended the call, my hands stayed steady, but my stomach turned cold. They were hunting it. They did not even know what it contained, and they were still hunting it. That told me everything. At 12:40 p.m., I drove to the sheriff's office. The building was plain, with faded posters on the wall and a front window where a deputy sat behind glass. The waiting area smelled like disinfectant and old coffee. A TV played a daytime show with the volume low. I took a seat and waited my turn, like a man applying for a permit. When the deputy called me forward, I explained in indirect speech that I wanted to file an informational report. I said I was not accusing anyone of a crime yet. I said I wanted a record of harassment and coercion attempts tied to an estate situation. I said my children were pressuring me to sign documents during grief and were contacting my workplace about my competence. I said someone tried to gain access to my storage unit without authorization. The deputy asked for names. I gave them. The deputy asked for dates and times. I gave what I had, clean and simple. The deputy asked if there were threats of violence. I said no. The deputy asked if anyone had stolen property. I said I had a missing folder from my office, but I did not know who took it, so I did not label it as theft without proof. The deputy nodded, and I could tell he respected that caution. He typed and printed a small acknowledgement number. He told me, in indirect speech, that the report created a record. He said if things escalated, the record would matter. I thanked him and left. When I stepped outside, the wind hit my face and cleared my head. I sat in my truck for a minute and stared at the dashboard. The day felt like walking on rebar. One wrong step, and you cut yourself. But I also felt something else. The system was waking up. The bank had a process. The recorder had receipts. The storage office logged calls. The sheriff's office made a record. These were not weapons. They were rails. They kept me from falling into chaos. At 2:05 p.m., my phone buzzed again. Breyer had posted something online. I did not go looking for fights, but one of my workers messaged me a screenshot, worried. In it, Breyer wrote about me in a way that sounded like concern, but read like a plan. Breyer said, in indirect speech, that I was grieving and might not be safe handling money. Breyer said the children were trying to protect the family from bad decisions. Breyer said they loved me, but they needed to step in. The words were smooth, but I could see the angle. Public record, public sympathy, public pressure. I forwarded the screenshot to Alma without comment. Alma replied with one short message. She said, in indirect speech, that public smears often backfire in court when timing is documented. She told me to save everything. At 3:30 p.m., Lark called. Lark's voice shook. Lark said Sedge asked Lark to sign something. Lark said Sedge called it mom's wishes. Lark said Sedge promised a fair split if Lark helped. Lark said Briar was also pushing and said I was being stubborn and selfish. Lark asked what to do. I told Lark, in indirect speech, not to sign anything. I told Lark to say yes to a meeting with Alma instead. I told Lark that if Mom had wishes, they were written properly, not whispered through pressure. Lark went quiet. Then Lark said, okay. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the empty chair where my wife used to sit. I felt grief rise like water, but I kept my hands still. I opened my notepad and wrote down every new fact from today. Jory's call, missing folder, storage access attempt, sheriff report number, Briar's public post, Lark's call about signing. I wrote it all with times. Then I called Alma and updated her with simple lines. Alma listened and then said something that made me sit straighter. She said, in indirect speech, that some trusts are built to punish contests and coercion. She said some plans are designed to stay quiet until the other side overreaches. She said if my children filed guardianship or pushed a forced sale, it might trigger the protective structure my wife built. She did not explain how. She did not show me papers. She only said the phrase that stayed in my mind like a warning bell. If they file it, the trust can snap shut. I set my phone down and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. My house was quiet, but my life was not. Outside, a car passed, and its headlights slid across the wall. I did not feel rage. I felt the cold focus of a man reading a blueprint before a storm. And as night came, I realized something simple and sharp. My children were getting louder. They thought loud meant strong. They did not understand that the quiet parts of the system were already moving. The day before, the hearing felt like a long breath held in the chest. I woke at 5:52 a.m. to the sound of rain tapping the kitchen window in slow, patient beats. The house still smelled like my wife's lotion in the hallway, but it was fading, and that made the silence sharper. I washed my face, put on clean work pants out of habit, and sat at the table with my notepad. I read my own timeline again, not because I enjoyed it, but because repetition turns fear into order. At 6:20 a.m., Alma texted that she needed me to stay calm and stay reachable. She said, in indirect speech, that we were close and that timing mattered more than emotion now. I replied that I understood, then I put my phone face down and finished a cup of tea I barely tasted. At 7:35 a.m., I drove to the hospice center. The parking lot was half full, and the building looked the same as it did when my wife was still inside, which felt unfair in a quiet way. In the hallway, the air smelled like sanitizer and plastic curtains. A cartwheel squeaked somewhere and then stopped. I saw Nurse Odelia Brandt near the nurse's station, holding a clipboard. She looked tired, but her eyes stayed steady. I greeted her and kept my voice low. I told her my attorney might request records through the correct channel, and I asked if she understood the process. Odelia said, in indirect speech, that she would comply with any lawful request and that her notes were factual. She said she could not discuss details with me now, but she could confirm that staff records existed and that times were recorded. She also said something small that landed hard. She said, in indirect speech, that the last week of a patient's life often brings out people's true faces and that staff notice patterns even when families pretend everything is love. I nodded once and thanked her. I did not try to pull a story out of her. I only needed to know the door was real, and it was. When I walked back to my truck at 8:10 a.m., my phone buzzed with a message from Briar. Briar said I was turning this into a public war. Briar said I was disrespecting Mom by fighting in court. Briar said I should drop the attorney and handle it as a family. The words looked like peace, but the pressure underneath them felt heavy. A second message came from Sedge. Sedge said he wanted peace too. Sedge said he did not want the family torn apart. Sedge added that if I kept pushing, I would lose everything anyway, and then I would regret it. I did not reply. I saved the messages. I took screenshots. I wrote the times in my notepad because that is what Alma told me to do. At 9:30 a.m., I met Lark at the diner off Route 6. The same cracked booth, the same smell of frying oil, the same tired waitress. Lark arrived late, eyes swollen, hands shaking around a paper cup. Lark looked younger than usual, like grief had scraped away whatever confidence was left. I did not lecture. I did not demand loyalty. I asked Lark, in indirect speech, how the night had been. Lark said it had been bad. Lark said Briar and Sedge kept talking about money like it was the only thing that mattered. Lark said they kept repeating that I was too stubborn and too old, and that I was not thinking clearly. Lark said they wanted Lark to sign one quick thing to prove unity. I asked what the thing was. Lark said Sedge called it a confirmation form, and Briar called it Mom's wishes. Lark said the paper looked official, and that made it scarier. I told Lark not to sign anything, and I said it calmly, like a foreman telling a new worker not to step onto a weak plank. I said if Mom had wishes, they were written properly and processed properly. I said people who love you do not rush you in grief. Lark swallowed hard and asked if I hated them. I said I did not hate my children. I said I hated what money was doing to them. I said it was turning them into strangers. Lark looked down and whispered that Sedge promised a fair split if Lark helped. Lark said Sedge implied that if Lark did not help, Lark would be left out. When Lark said that, I felt a cold clarity again. This was not only about me. They were trying to control the weakest link, the softest heart, the person most likely to fold. I asked Lark if they had the hard hat. Lark nodded and said it was in the trunk of their car under a blanket. Lark said nobody noticed. I told Lark to keep it that way. I told Lark to keep it safe and not show it to Briar or Sedge. Lark asked why it mattered. I said Mom chose what mattered, and I trusted her more than I trusted fear. Lark looked like they wanted to ask more, but the diner felt too public for deeper words. I gave Lark Alma's number again and told Lark to meet Alma before the hearing, even if only for 10 minutes. Lark nodded slowly and said, okay. At 11:15 a.m., I drove past the bank without going in. I did not want to appear like I was gathering power. I only wanted to keep my movements plain. Alma had told me, in indirect speech, that we would not poke the system in public. The system would speak when it was time. Still, I caught myself looking at the bank doors and thinking of my wife. I wondered how many quiet steps she took while I was busy building houses and solving job site problems. I wondered how many nights she lay awake planning for this exact kind of greed. The thought hurt, but it also felt like a hand on my shoulder, steadying me. At 12:40 p.m., Alma called and said she needed a short check-in. Her voice was controlled, like a person reading a list. She asked if Briar or Sedge had tried to corner me. I said they had messaged me and tried to push guilt. Alma said, in indirect speech, that guilt is the cheapest tool in inheritance fights. She told me the hearing schedule was confirmed and that we needed to arrive early. She also said, in indirect speech, that the bank had responded to her properly and that everything was aligned for the courtroom, not for the parking lot. I asked if we were ready. Alma said we were ready for the truth, and truth is always ready when you keep it clean. At 2:05 p.m., I went to my construction yard again, not because I wanted to work, but because work helps me breathe. The yard was loud with normal life. A truck reversed with a beep, a saw whined in the distance, men shouted measurements and laughed at something small. That noise was honest. Jory Pell walked over and asked how I was doing. I told him I was okay and that the hearing was tomorrow. Jory nodded and said, in indirect speech, that he had told Briar nothing useful and that he would keep doing that. He said if anyone showed up at the yard asking questions, he would call me and Alma. I thanked him. I did not ask him to fight. I only asked him to stay steady. At 4:10 p.m., I drove home and sat on the front steps for a few minutes, watching a leaf spin on the wet sidewalk. My phone buzzed again. Briar called this time. I let it ring. Then Sedge called. I let it ring. They texted right after. Briar said, in indirect speech, that court would be humiliating for the family and that I would regret it. Sedge said, in indirect speech, that if I dropped the attorney tonight, they could take care of me and keep me comfortable. The phrase take care of me made my stomach tighten, because it sounded like control wearing a soft mask. I saved everything. I wrote the times. I did not answer. I barely slept that night. At 3:30 a.m., I stood in the hallway and looked at my wife's photo on the wall. I did not speak out loud, but in my mind, I told her I was trying to do this the right way. I told her I was staying calm. I told her I was not throwing punches or screaming. I was simply refusing to be erased. At 7:05 a.m. on hearing day, I met Alma outside the courthouse. The building was tall and pale, like it had no interest in anyone's pain. The steps were damp, and the air was cold enough to sting my nose. Alma wore a plain dark suit and carried a thin case. She looked like she had already been awake for hours. She asked if I was okay. I said I was steady. Alma nodded once and told me to keep my hands empty and my mouth quiet unless she asked me to speak. Inside, the courthouse smelled like old paper and floor cleaner. A guard checked our bags. People stood in small clusters, whispering. The hallway lights made everyone look tired. We found the benches outside courtroom 3B at 8:12 a.m. The number on the door was black and clean. I sat down and kept my eyes forward. At 8:30 a.m., I saw Briar and Sedge arrive. Briar wore a sharp coat and walked like a person entering a stage. Sedge carried a thick folder, held tight like a shield. They did not come alone. Breyer had 2 relatives with them, people I recognized from holidays, now wearing the same worried faces Breyer had planted in the church basement. When Breyer saw me, Breyer's expression turned into a thin smile. Breyer walked closer and spoke loud enough for nearby people to hear. Breyer said, in indirect speech, that I looked unwell and that this court situation was proof I could not handle loss properly. Breyer asked if I was here to embarrass Mom's memory. Breyer said it like a sermon. I did not answer. I looked at the wall behind Breyer, not at Breyer's eyes. Alma stayed seated and watched like a person counting beats in a song. Sedge stepped in and said, in indirect speech, that we could still settle it privately if I stopped being stubborn. Sedge said the paperwork was ready and that I only had to cooperate. I still did not answer. The silence made Breyer's smile twitch. Breyer tried again and said, in indirect speech, that I would leave court with nothing and that I should prepare for that reality. Breyer said it like a victory lap. Then something small happened that felt important. A court clerk walked past with a stack of files, and Breyer's voice lowered for a second. Breyer asked Sedge if everything was activated. Sedge nodded too quickly and said yes. Alma's eyes moved toward them, and I could see she caught that word. Activated. It was not a grief word. It was an action word. At 9:05 a.m., Lark appeared at the far end of the hallway. Lark looked pale and frightened, but still walked toward me. Breyer saw Lark and stiffened. Sedge moved fast, like he wanted to intercept. Alma stood up and stepped between them without touching anyone. She said, in indirect speech, that Lark could sit where Lark wanted and that intimidation in a courthouse hallway was a bad idea. Sedge's face tightened, but he stopped. Lark sat beside me, not too close, but close enough to show a choice. I did not speak to Lark right then. I only nodded once. Lark nodded back. At 9:18 a.m., a vending machine ate Lark's bill when Lark tried to buy water. Lark stared at it like it was the last straw in a hard week. Alma quietly pressed the refund button and got the bill back with a calm patience that felt almost symbolic. Nothing dramatic, just a small correction. Then Alma handed Lark a bottle of water she already had. Lark took it with shaking hands. At 9:30 a.m., the hallway noise dropped when the courtroom door opened. A clerk stepped out and called the case name. The sound echoed off the walls. My stomach tightened, but my hands stayed still on my knees. Alma leaned close and spoke so softly only I could hear. She said, in indirect speech, that now we open what they forced. Courtroom 3B smelled like old paper, floor cleaner, and damp coats. The benches were hard. The lights were bright in a way that makes everyone look tired. I sat behind Alma Keene at 9:36 a.m. with my hands folded like I was waiting for a safety briefing on a job site. Breyer sat across the aisle with a sharp posture and a face set for victory. Sedge sat beside Breyer, folder on his lap, fingers tight on the edges. Lark sat 2 seats behind me, holding a water bottle with both hands, eyes wide and wet. The judge entered without drama. The clerk spoke the case name and the room rose and sat again. The judge looked down at the papers and then looked up at Breyer and Sedge first, not at me. The judge asked in indirect speech why a property sale had been discussed publicly before proper authority was set. The judge asked who instructed a realtor and when. Breyer's mouth opened fast. Breyer said, in indirect speech, that the children were trying to protect the estate and that I was grieving and not stable. Breyer said they were acting out of love and responsibility. The judge turned slightly toward Sedge and asked in indirect speech what exact relief they were seeking. Sedge stood and spoke carefully. Sedge said they wanted temporary control over the house and business interests to prevent bad decisions. Sedge said I could be confused and could be pressured by outsiders. Sedge said the children wanted to keep me comfortable. The words sounded soft, but the request sounded like a lock. Alma stood. She did not raise her voice. She said, in indirect speech, that grief is not incompetence and that coercion is not protection. She said my children tried to push signatures at a funeral and in private spaces while I was vulnerable. She said they had also started a public campaign to label me unstable. Alma asked the judge to consider the timeline and the conduct. She said there was a structure in place that controlled this estate and that the children's conduct was the exact kind of conduct the structure was built to stop. The judge asked Alma what structure. Alma said it was a trust established by my wife with clear provisions and an independent administration path. Breyer's face tightened. Breyer said, in indirect speech, that there was no trust, or if there was, it would obviously benefit the children because they were the children. Breyer said I was trying to steal what belonged to them. Alma did not argue with the emotion. She moved to facts. She handed the clerk a binder. The clerk brought it to the judge. Alma said in indirect speech that she would present the trust instrument and the relevant clauses, and she would also present the evidence showing why the trigger was met. My stomach tightened when she said trigger, because it sounded like a machine part, not a family word. But I stayed still. The judge looked at the first pages for a long time. The room went quiet enough that I could hear someone shifting in the back row. The judge asked in indirect speech if the trust was properly executed and valid. Alma said yes. The judge asked if there was an independent administrator or trust officer. Alma said yes, and she requested the court hear from the bank's trust officer under the proper process. Vesper Hale was called. Vesper walked to the front with a controlled face and a folder held close. Vesper placed her hand on the Bible, spoke the oath, and sat. Alma asked Vesper, in indirect speech, if the trust relationship existed and if the trust administration was prepared to act based on court recognition. Vesper answered in plain terms. Vesper said the trust existed. Vesper said the bank's trust administration could implement restrictions and transfers once the court recognized the right authority and once the trust terms required action. Vesper said it was designed to prevent rushed exploitation. When she said exploitation, Breyer's mouth pulled tight like a knot. Sedge stood and tried to question Vesper. Sedge said, in indirect speech, that Vesper could not know family intent and that the children were simply doing what Mom wanted. Vesper answered calmly. Vesper said the trust terms, not family speeches, controlled administration. Vesper said the bank followed written instructions and court-recognized authority. Vesper did not look at me for approval. She did not need to. She was not here for feelings. She was here for process. Then Alma called Nurse Odelia Brandt. Odelia wore plain scrubs under a sweater, hair pulled back, face tired and steady. She testified with the same tone she used in the hallway. Alma asked in indirect speech whether hospice maintained shift logs, visitor records, and staff notes. Odelia said yes. Alma asked whether those records showed who visited my wife during the final week and what requests were made. Odelia said yes, and she described the logs in simple language. She said names were recorded. She said times were recorded. She said certain visits were calm and loving, and certain visits involved pressure about phones, passwords, and documents. She did not dramatize it. She said it like reporting vital signs. Breyer's face changed. Breyer shook their head and said, in indirect speech, that it was not true and that nurses misunderstand families. Odelia did not argue. Odelia said the logs were factual. Odelia said the notes were time-stamped and written at the time, not later. Odelia said staff had no reason to invent family conflict. She said, in indirect speech, that staff only cared about patient comfort and pressure reduced comfort. That sentence landed in the room like a weight. Alma then called Garrick Mott, the funeral director. Garrick walked in with a stiff posture and a folder that looked like it had been held too tightly. He testified that the funeral home had a contract and that changes required proper authorization. Alma asked, in indirect speech, if someone attempted to change payment responsibility and control details during the service day. Garrick said yes. He said a change slip was presented. He said signatures were attempted. He said the timing was rushed. He said he refused to finalize anything without proper authority. Garrick glanced at Breyer and Sedge once, then back to the judge, like he was relieved to finally speak in the right place. The judge asked why someone would do that during a funeral. Garrick said, in indirect speech, that some families treat a funeral like a transfer desk. He said he had seen it before. He said it was ugly, and it was why he kept careful records. My hands stayed folded, but inside my chest something tightened and then settled. My wife had been right to plan. She had known grief could be used as cover. She had left a system that did not care about shouting. Sedge stood again. Sedge said, in indirect speech, that even if some people acted messy, the children were still the children, and the estate belonged to them. Sedge said the court should grant them control because it was logical. Breyer added that I was being manipulated by an attorney and that I was too stubborn to see the truth. Breyer said I would waste everything out of spite. Alma did not answer the insult. She turned to the judge and said, in indirect speech, that this was the key point. She said the trust included a clause designed to stop contests, coercion, and exploitation. She said it was not hidden. It was written clearly. She said it stated that if any named beneficiary attempted to force control through coercion, false incapacity claims, fraud, or contests against the trust's administration, that beneficiary would be removed. She said the assets would not then fall back to the remaining children. She said they would redirect to the trust's alternate beneficiaries. The judge asked who the alternate beneficiaries were. Alma answered calmly. She said the primary redirect was a workers' safety and training foundation connected to my wife's values, plus a specific set of named beneficiaries my wife listed in the trust for personal items and limited gifts. Alma said the children would receive nothing if the clause triggered. She said the clause existed because my wife did not want her life's work turned into a fight that rewarded cruelty. The courtroom went still. I heard a small sound from Breyer's side, like a breath that failed. Breyer stood and said, in indirect speech, that it was impossible and that Mom would never do that to her own children. Breyer said Mom loved them. Alma said love and boundaries can exist at the same time, and that the paper showed what my wife chose. Sedge's face turned pale. Sedge said, in indirect speech, that they never contested anything and that they were only seeking temporary protection. Alma responded with the timeline. She said there were documented attempts to force signatures. She said there were documented attempts to seize phones and accounts. She said there were public statements and workplace calls aimed at building an incompetence record. She said there was a logged attempt to access my storage unit by claiming family emergency. She said, in indirect speech, that these actions fit the coercion and exploitation triggers described in the trust. The judge asked Sedge if they had attempted to file or threaten guardianship or incapacity-based control. Sedge hesitated. Then Sedge said it was only discussed as a possibility for my own good. The judge's face hardened slightly at that. The judge said, in indirect speech, that courts do not like possibilities used as leverage. Breyer began speaking fast, trying to shift blame. Breyer said Sedge handled paperwork. Breyer said Breyer only wanted fairness. Sedge snapped back and said Breyer made the public speeches and pushed the pressure. They spoke over each other until the judge raised a hand. The clerk said to stop. The room quieted again. Then the judge asked me, in indirect speech, if I wanted to speak. Alma looked back at me for a second, and I nodded once. I stood. My knees felt stiff, but my voice stayed calm. I said my wife loved our children, but she also knew their weaknesses. I said she asked for peace, and they chose speed. I said I did not come to punish them with anger. I came to let my wife's choices be respected. I said I would accept whatever the court required, but I would not sign away my life at a funeral, and I would not be called incompetent because my children wanted my keys. The judge looked at the binder again. The judge asked Vesper, in indirect speech, if the bank could implement the trust's enforcement once the court ruled the clause was triggered. Vesper said yes. The judge asked what that would mean today. Vesper said accounts under the trust structure could be restricted from the disinherited parties immediately. Vesper said access attempts would be blocked. Vesper said any pending sale actions would be frozen until the trust administrator completed lawful steps. The judge then spoke slowly, reading parts and summarizing. The judge said the trust was valid. The judge said the evidence supported a finding of coercion attempts and improper pressure during a vulnerable period. The judge said the no contest and anti-coercion clause triggered by these actions was enforceable under the presented facts and law. The judge said Breyer and Sedge were removed as beneficiaries under the trust. The judge said any attempted sale or transfer by them was void and prohibited. The judge ordered that all trust-controlled assets be administered according to the trust terms and that the bank trust department was authorized to act under the trust's administration path. Breyer made a sound like a choke and said, in indirect speech, that it was not fair. Sedge's hands shook as he gathered his folder, like the folder could protect him. The judge did not soften. The judge added that the court would refer suspicious conduct for review, including any attempted misuse of records or pressure tactics tied to financial exploitation of a vulnerable person. The judge said it plainly. The judge said it as a consequence, not as a threat. The clerk slid an order forward. The judge signed. The pen scratched paper in a small, final sound. Alma did not smile. She only closed her folder and placed her hand lightly on the back of my chair, guiding me to sit. Breyer turned toward me, eyes wide, and said my name like it could pull me back into being a father first. Sedge looked at me like I had become a stranger. Lark covered their mouth with one hand, crying without noise. I did not speak again. There was nothing useful left to say in that room. The system had spoken. The judge stood. The clerk said the order was effective immediately. The sound of those words filled the courtroom like a door locking, clean and final.